Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to a special episode of the Film Stories podcast.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. As always, there's absolutely everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, well, title gives this one away. I'm here to talk of the stories of films, and I tend to talk about development stories, production stories, marketing stories, release stories, all the bits and bobs, really, that go to make the films that we know and sometimes love. Just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. Now, what you've happened upon here is one of my occasional special episodes of the podcast where I talk to a filmmaker about their body of work. And I'm delighted that this is one really close to my heart. I am, as many of you are, a huge nerd fan of the Back to the Future trilogy. And you may or may not be aware that there is a stage musical of Back to the Future that's opening in London at the Adelphi Theatre, which I should declare I've not been able to see yet, but I'm going to go and see as soon as I possibly can. Now, the book to that musical has been penned by Bob Gale, who wrote and produced the Back to the Future trilogy in conjunction with Robert Zemeckis, who directed them. And I was delighted that Gale joined me for this special episode of Film Stories to talk about the trilogy of movies, to talk about turning it into a musical, to talk about his sole directorial effort to date, Interstate 60, and basically the origins of his career and his ambitions and thoughts on the business. Now, this was recorded over Zoom. Gale was in London. He was travelling around. He was somewhere posh in Trafalgar Square, he said. But there is a bit of background noise for this one. And so please do bear that in mind when you listen to the interview. On two separate occasions, it sounds as though the police are coming for him, I think. But please be assured that he did nothing wrong and they absolutely weren't. But without further ado, what I'm going to do is going to play you a selection of clips from the Back to the Future films, just because I want to, and also I'm talking to the person who helped create them. And then the other side of that, I'm going to come straight into my conversation with Bob Gale. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did.
No. This sucker's electrical. But I need a nuclear reaction to generate the 1.21 gigawatts of electricity.
What did I just say?
The flux capacitor stores. This sucker's electrical. But I need a nuclear reaction to generate the 1.21 gigawatts of electricity.
1.21 gigawatts! 1.21 gigawatts! Great Scott!
Hey, McFly! Thought I done told you never to come in. Hey, you ain't shameless, McFly. You look like him, though. Especially with that dog ugly hat. You kin to that, hey, barber? What's your name, dude?
Mart Eastwood. Clint Eastwood.
What kind of stupid name is that?
Hey, Doc, you better back up. We don't have enough road to get up to 88.
Roads? Where we're going, we don't need roads.
Hey, Marty! Marty! Marty, I wanted to show you these new matchbooks for my auto detailing I had printed up.
My DeLorean?
That was, well, it was a medley of clips from the Back to the Future films. I had to do the Back to the Future films because I'm joined by writer, producer, sometimes director as well, which I want to talk to him about too, Bob Gale, who's joining me from London. Hello, Bob. How are you?
I'm great, Simon. I am just great. Happy to report.
Now that is good. That is good. And you're in London. I don't think it's a massive spoiler to say, involved in a rather big production taking place in the West End. So can you just give me a kind of snapshot of what today is looking like for you in the world of making a huge musical?
Well, Back to the Future, the musical, had its first preview on Friday at the Adelphi Theatre in the West End. We had 2 more preview performances on Saturday, and we are having our 4th preview performance this evening. So after we finish our podcast, I'll be going over to the theater for rehearsals. We are tweaking little things here and there, revising music cues, making little dialogue tweaks, all kinds of little invisible things to the audience, but all of which add up to improve the experience each and every night.
Well, I'm going to jump forward a question or two there, as you brought that up, because I've just read a recent memoir of the late great Mike Nichols. It's written by a man called Mark Harris. It's a really terrific book, and it talks about Mike Nichols going between the film world and the theatre world. And it struck me that there's a point in film where it stops, where you can't appreciate we're in the world of director's cuts and people going back and altering film, but nonetheless, fundamentally, you've written your last word on it and you can change no more. And now you're in the world of theatre, and what we're up to 4 previews, plus all the work that you did in Manchester as well. And I'm curious how you're finding almost having no point of no return, to use Back to the Future parlance, on a project.
It's really a joy. It gives us a chance. We'll all talk about, say, well, do you think this line will work? Do you think this beat will work? Do you think this gag will work? Well, let's try it. I mean, that's what's so great. We can just say, let's try it. And we would constantly try lines in Manchester, and we're doing the same thing here. And if the audience didn't laugh enough, or sometimes didn't laugh at all, said, oh, okay, we got to change that. Or, oh, they're not getting that one. Let's see if we can make that better. Or there's all kinds of variations on that. But to have that ability to test it in a live audience night after night. I mean, listen, you hear about stand-up comedians that they'll just go out and they'll test their material and find out what the audience laughs at and what they don't. So this is very much akin to that process.
And I mean, for you, just going back to the writer in you. I mean, I'm always taken by I think it was the writing of Chinatown that Robert Town wrote about once, and he talked about all the accidents that came together to make that work, and the fact that it stopped, and the very fact that it had to stop at some point meant it was complete. Do you like the idea of working with something that feels living, really?
Well, for now, yes, I do, because it's new. It's all new to me. Yeah. To have this freedom. Now, of course, after another week or 10 days or so, we'll pretty much lock the show down. But at the same time, what happens, as you know, in theater is sometimes things don't go exactly as you plan. For example, and this is not a big spoiler for anybody who's seen the movie, we do a version of the tabletop model scene in Doc Brown's lab, where he shows Marty how he's going to send him back to 1985, and the toy car catches on fire, and Doc grabs a fire extinguisher to put it out. Well, on our first preview, the stagehands forgot to put the fire extinguisher on the set. So Roger Bart, who plays Doc Brown, he's running around. I know there's a fire extinguisher somewhere. There's got to be a fire extinguisher. I mean, he just kept vamping, and then finally stagehand came out with a fire extinguisher, and the audience actually applauded that. We're not going to do that again, but it's an indication of what theater trained actors, they just know that sometimes this stuff happens, and so does the audience. And that's kind of nice, because in theater, there's sort of an unwritten contract that the audience has with the performers, that everybody knows that, these are performers on a stage, and they're right there in front of you, and mistakes will happen, and that's okay, because they do. You wouldn't allow that to happen in a movie. You go back and you fix that mistake. But, live theater, sure, that's going to happen. And audiences they're very good natured about that. And okay, yeah, all right, let's show must go on. Let's fix that and keep on going.
It must be rare to do a project of this ilk as well. Just talking about the fan response to that, where you pretty much know that the audience is on your side before they've walked in the door. And I can't think of too many other big stage musicals that would be quite like that.
Well, yes, but that of course was a double-edged sword with us.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Because I mean, when they opened Mary Poppins in New York, and they didn't have a single song from the movie in it, the audiences went insane. That was not what they wanted out of Mary Poppins. So they shut the show down and they went back and they put in all the familiar songs that we love from the movie. And, then people went to the show and had a good time. So our challenge was to say, okay, we're calling this Back to the Future the Musical, which is a pretty high bar, and we can't screw this up. And in fact, we had many conversations, Bob Zemeckis, Alan Silvestri, Glenn Ballard, and I, that if this show isn't good enough, we shouldn't put it on, because we don't want, the last thing we would want is for people to say, oh, it was a money grab. They're just kind of exploiting the title. No. We could not do that to our fans or to ourselves, because we have never made a Back to the Future Part 4. We never planned to make a Back to the Future 4 for exactly that reason. It's okay. We told the story we wanted in 3 movies, and we're not going back to that well, because if we do, people will say, the 4th one doesn't really belong in the same category as the first 3, as is the case with many higher numbered sequels, the names of which I will not mention.
Yeah, I think I can say I'm probably imagining some of the same ones. Rocky IV, the obvious exception. That's clearly an Oscar-winning masterpiece in the making. I did watch a film last night, though. Just going back to the start of your story, really, and this film seemed to be telling me to turn off the roads that I knew and to take a chance on the ones that I don't. And it was your film, of course, the film that you directed, Interstate 60. And I'm curious, I mean, it's such a journey that you've been on. And I wonder if you can take me right back to the start of where your personal thirst to want to tell stories came from.
Well, this goes way back to when I was probably 8 or 9 years old, and doing creative writing in grammar school, when they said, okay, your assignment is to write a story and read it in front of the class. And we'd have to do this a couple times a year. And, by the 3rd time, whenever I got up there to read my story, everybody in the class kind of sat up and said, oh, good. Oh, Bob Gale's got a story. It's going to be a good one. So I got some good feedback about my storytelling ability, as long ago as in the 3rd or the 4th grade. And the idea that could be my career, it wasn't really something that I thought about too much. I took up filmmaking as a hobby by the time I was in high school, and I had a good time doing that. But again, it was just a hobby. It was a fun thing to do. And how are you going to make a living doing that? Especially if you're living in St. Louis, Missouri, which is where I was. And Hollywood was 2,000 miles away. And my dad was an attorney, and he expected his kids to do something professional. And what happened finally was that I actually, my freshman year in college, I went to engineering school at Tulane University in New Orleans. Yeah. And I was always good in math and science, and I still enjoy math and science. And so they tell you, oh, if you're good in math and science, you should go into engineering. but I didn't like engineering school. I didn't like the people I was with. They were just really, they were just kind of really narrowly focused, and I had bigger ideas. And there was a kid in my dorm, and he said, who was also an amateur filmmaker, and he said, you know, they got film schools in California? I said, really? He said, yeah. He said, if you can make your hobby into your career, then it won't feel like you're going to work every day when you're doing it. And I said, well, no guidance counselor ever gave me that advice, but that makes a whole lot of sense. So I transferred out to the University of Southern California, USC, and I got into the cinema department, and that's where I met Robert Zemeckis, and we discovered that we had a whole lot in common, and we decided, hey, let's team up and make Hollywood movies when we get out of school.
How I mean, how core how core is that friendship to you? Because I think when we talk about your story, I'm trying to restrain my absolute fandom for Back to the Future here, but before you got to the perfect film, you had a couple of bumps and disappointments. And I think of something like 1941, which is far more liked now than it was at the time. But I wonder, the fact that the two of you went through the process of that film and that not hitting in the way, the box office certainly, that you may have hoped, did it help that it was the two of you going through that together? Was there kind of...
Sure. It helps all throughout the creative process. To have somebody who you trust to bounce ideas off. In the writing process, it's essential to say, okay, you know, what do you think of this? Because it prevents you from getting too self-indulgent, which is, you know, that's an occupational hazard when you're a writer. So, but what we learned from our first two movies, which I Want to Hold Your Hand and Used Cars. They played great with the audience. The audience loved those movies, but we just couldn't get people to go to the cinema just to see them. So we learned that, okay, we know how to tell a story. We know how to make people laugh. We know how to keep people interested. We never thought that our job was, how do we get people to come to the movie theater? So that's something that we may need to work on, but at least we knew that on a craft level, we actually kind of did know what we were doing. And I must say, looking back on it, having the experience of failure makes it a lot easier for you to deal with success, because there's so much randomness involved in how things happen. And the worst thing that happens to people is they get impressed with themselves. They get a big head about, oh yeah, my first movie is a big hit, I'm a genius, and I can do whatever I want because I got all these good reviews and people went to see my show. Well, you know, we actually, in the making of Back to the Future, we got to experience an alternate universe of Back to the Future, and that was Back to the Future starring Eric Stoltz.
Of course.
And so here we were, and we saw 5 weeks of cut footage with Eric Stoltz as Marty McFly, and we said, you know, we know what we wrote, but what we're seeing here isn't as good as what we wrote. And we decided to push the red button and say, we got to stop with this guy and get somebody else. Michael J. Fox, of course, had always been our first choice. And, you know, that whole story has been told many times. And for those listening that don't know it, check out the movies that made us on Netflix. There's a Back to the Future episode that's very good and very accurate. But what that was another great lesson for us to say, okay, you can have a brilliant script, you can have a great director, you can have a fantastic crew and supporting characters, but if there's a black hole in the middle of your leading man, if we hadn't replaced Eric with Michael, you and I wouldn't be talking here today.
I don't know how familiar you are with Doctor Who over here, but there's a podcast done with a brilliant writer, Russell T Davies, and it was Brett Goldstein's excellent podcast. I should Films to be Buried. I should credit that as well. But he talked about, and this hugely acclaimed writer, I've heard loads of people do the same, talk about Back to the Future being this perfect film, but also how it really doesn't have a villain. It doesn't play necessarily by the rules we expect. And watching Interstate 60 as well, I kind of felt, that you're not playing necessarily by given rules of a genre. And whenever I've spoken to Robert Zemeckis, he always talked of people at Blockbuster never knew what genre to put his films in on the shelf. And I wonder if part of that comes from you, really, that, you don't seem to work within very strict tramlines of what a film should or shouldn't be.
Well, when you're doing something original,
yeah,
that's what makes it original, to try to do something that, kind of breaks the rules, that violates some of the genre rules. Now, the structure of Back to the Future, I would refer to it as a nested structure. There's the story of Marty McFly, who ends up back in time, and all he wants to do is get home, but he can't get home until he accomplishes the mission of putting his parents back together. So there's two plots, but one plot is inside the other, as opposed to two plots going on concurrently, which is what happens in, the majority of movies. So that just made sense. It's a little bit like The Wizard of Oz. Dorothy ends up in this place that all she wants to do is go home, and she can't go home until she accomplishes a mission, and then she gets to go home. So it's been done before, like everything else, and we have a time travel wrinkle in our version.
You also did, and you've done that on two. I mean, what strikes me is you've done that on two very different scales. That with Interstate 60, I'm guessing that was indie funded or certainly a lower budget production, with a degree more freedom. And then Back to the Future and its sequels within the parameters of a studio system. I'm just wondering what the contrasting challenges are there, where you are just taking a slightly different route to everybody else.
Well, with Interstate 60, I wanted to direct a movie.
Yeah.
And I knew that in order for me to direct a movie, it had to be cheap. And I had to be able to make it cheap. But what I also knew is that in order to get the financing for the movie, I had to attract some really good talent.
Yeah.
But I couldn't afford to have really good talent for a whole long time. So I came up with this idea, what if I do this road picture that's sort of a modern day twist on Gulliver's Travels, and every place that the main character goes, he can meet somebody who can be played by a really good actor, and then I only have to pay the really good actor for 3 days of work, but he or she is in the movie, and people say, "Oh my God, that's Chris Cooper in there. Oh, Christopher Lloyd is in there. Whoa." I called up Kurt Russell. I said, "Kurt, can I get you to do a day?" He said, "Sure, for you, Bob, I'll do it." Michael J. Fox, same thing. Yeah. He said, "Gale, it's about time you started directing. I'll do anything for you." So by knowing that was the challenge for me as a storyteller, to say, okay, what are the kind of stories that can be told where a character is on a quest, and we can just all we have to do is go back to the Odyssey, right? Every place that Odysseus or Ulysses, whichever version you're looking at, every place he goes, there's something really interesting going on in those different environments, and that's what I was trying to duplicate.
Did you enjoy directing? Did you enjoy the making of that film?
I did. I love telling people what to do.
I mean, was there any? Was it always in your head going to be a one-off, or was that just the circumstances as you found yourself at the time that there's not been another?
What, Interstate 60 or?
Well, another directing job. It's.
Oh yeah, no, I've been trying to get other directing jobs, but Interstate 60, we had problems getting a distributor for it, and of course that didn't help because what did he direct? Oh, some movie nobody ever saw. You can stream it on Amazon.
Yeah.
And now, look, I'm 70 years old. People say, well, he's too old to direct movies. But hey, okay, I'm having a blast doing Back to the Future, the musical. So I got nothing to complain about in my life.
Isn't it strange? You get to, I mean, you say you're 70 years old, and that's apparently too old to direct movies, but it's perfect for putting a West End musical together. Do you find that odd, or do you just like accept that that's kind of the way that the entertainment business seems to have gone?
Well, whether you accept it or not, it's ridiculous, really, to say that somebody who is a veteran filmmaker, a veteran novelist, a veteran storyteller, that Hollywood doesn't go to those people. But there's a psychological thing that goes on too that people that are outside the business don't understand, which is I go in to take a meeting about a movie project, and the executive that I'm meeting with is probably young enough to be my son, right?
Yeah.
Or daughter. And they are on a level intimidated by the fact, oh my God, this is the guy that wrote Back to the Future. He knows a whole lot more than I do.
Yeah.
And so do you want to hire somebody who you have to be really secure in your job to hire somebody who knows more than you do? Now, I mean, that's why our musical is great, because the attitude, which is the attitude that I've always had as a producer and Bob Zemeckis has had as a director, you hire the very best people that you can find, people who know more than you do, and let them do what they do, because they're going to bring more to the party than you could have possibly done on your own. And it's going to make the work way, way better because of that.
Presumably what that buys you is almost a focus on the small as much as anything. Appreciating musicals are expected to be huge spectacles and such now. I read the book on the making of taking Spider-Man to Broadway, and I just read it just thinking, this is staggering. It's just like the creative decisions are all being taken over by what a computer can do and how they can map that, and they're having to reconstruct this, and it's taking all that time. With you, with what you bring to it, I'm presumably a large part of it is you're zeroed in on the smallness of the story at the heart of it, and just
that's the whole thing about Back to the Future.
Yeah,
people say, "Oh, it's this big science fiction movie. It's time travel." No, it's not. It's a movie it's a story about these people.
Yeah,
we love Marty. We love George. We love Lorraine. We hate, but we love Biff. And of course, Doc Brown, everybody loves Doc Brown. So it's the characters. And that is what makes all great cinema, all great theater, all great storytelling, a television series, right?
Yeah.
Why do we watch a series week after week after week? Because we love those characters. So we have a lot of bells and whistles and special effects, and in the musical, lots of really spectacular numbers. But the heart of it is the fact that no matter what medium you're in, when George McFly punches Biff in the parking lot at the school dance, the audience goes crazy with applause. We've wound them up with that, and they want that release. And then when he kisses Lorraine on the dance floor, more applause. It's really a very, very human story.
I watched, I mean, going back to my own youth, I watched Back to the Future and The Goonies on the same day. And that still strikes me as two films with a masterclass in relatable stakes. That it's not about necessarily saving the world or anything like that. It's just saving something so much smaller. And it does feel like we've kind of lost sight of that a little bit.
Yeah, I certainly, all these big comic book movies, they need villains who are bigger and more powerful, and you know, Spider-Man never stops a bank robber anymore, right?
Yeah. Yeah, well, quite. As we talk, a trailer's been released for a new Spider-Man film, which I'm sure will be a lot of fun, which just seems to be lots and lots of old Spider-Man films in big Spider-Man films. And I kind of feel like I need a degree just to go in and see it, which again, they're very good at making these films. So I'm not being snotty towards them or anything. One thing I'm really always, though, fascinated by, because you get asked a lot about Back to the Future, you get asked a lot about the individual film. I'm a huge fan of the third film, but I'm also wondering, what was the human being bit being in the middle of the back-to-back filming? That little gap between the second and the third film, because I read Robert Zemeckis' angle of how a story of how he has to shoot bits of Back to the Future 3 and then fly back and edit the second one, and it just strikes me as a particularly insane time. But I'm just wondering where you were in that, what your take on it was. If you feel like almost the post-production of the second film, which I love enormously, was a little too truncated, for instance.
Well, it probably was. I mean, Bob was shooting Back to the Future Part 3 in Northern California, and I had to go back to the studio to supervise the sound mixing and dubbing of Back to the Future 2. And this was the point where Bob would shoot in Sonora, California during the daytime. When the sun went down and we lost the light, he'd jump on a private plane, he'd fly down. We'd have dinner waiting for him at Universal. He'd come into the stage. I'd play him back what we mixed today. He'd make his notes. He'd talk to the sound guys about what was working and what wasn't. He went to sleep at the Sheraton Universal Hotel, got up at 4:30 the next morning. Car took him to the Burbank Airport, flew back up, and I went back to the studio and put his notes in play and mixed the next reel. And we did that for 2 weeks. It was nuts. It really was. And again, it was a testament to him being able to keep all this in his head, and to the great people that we had working with us. We had one film editor up in Sonora with Bob, and the other film editor was down on the sound dubbing stage with me. And ILM was just going crazy trying to get all the visual effects finished. And then we had to sneak a sneak preview or two in to see if this was working. So yeah, it was not something we would ever do again. That's for sure.
I mean, it sounds like such a fundamental, dim question, but I pride myself on asking it. But could you enjoy that bit of the process? Was there any fun, really, in the release of the second film for you at the point it was happening, given the pressures you were under getting the next one ready, for instance?
Well, it was really kind of the weekend that Back to the Future 2 opened in the United States was Thanksgiving weekend, 1989. And that Monday, the Monday after our opening weekend, we were all in Monument Valley shooting the Monument Valley sequences for Back to the Future Part 3. And of course there was no internet back then, right? So we were relying on phone calls from the studio and trying to get a copy of USA Today to find out how did our movie open.
Good, great.
And we were just going, oh my God, it's a big hit, it's great. And I mean, that was certainly energizing, but it didn't stop us or slow us down from the fact that, hey, we got to keep shooting here. We got to keep shooting.
So what was coming up? You said you managed to sneak in time for just a couple of little test screenings. Was there anything monumental coming in at that point? Because presumably there wasn't an awful lot of wiggle room to do much with it.
No, the main thing, I mean, there were just a lot of tightening things that we did, scenes that played too long. And the one thing that the audiences did not understand, and we realized in hindsight why they didn't understand it, and so we cut it out. In the original inception of the story, the original cut, when old Biff comes back to 2015 and he staggers out of the DeLorean.
Yeah.
And he falls. We had him erasing from existence. He had come back to a 2015 in which he no longer existed. And that was something that the audience just couldn't get their head around, that because they didn't know where he had come from. That's something that would only make sense if you see the movie a second time. So we said, okay, we'll just have him collapse as if the stress of traveling through time, gave him a seizure or a heart attack or something, and leave it go at that. And that worked just fine. Nobody had a problem with that. But in our heads, in fact, for those of you who are gigantic Back to the Future fans, let me recommend the IDW comic book graphic novel called Biff to the Future. And Biff to the Future is the story of what happened when Biff got the sports almanac and going through the entire alternate timeline of Biff slowly taking over Hill Valley, how he had George McFly killed, how he married Lorraine, all of that, and what finally happened to him. So it's a lot of fun. I was involved in all the IDW comics, but that was the one that I spent the most time with the other comic book writer, refining it and making it great, because it's just such an insane story.
Just before we run out of time, I do want to talk about Back to the Future Part 3, because it does seem to be the one that's talked about the least, and it's such a pure film. And I adore that film.
Thank you.
And I recall that again, I chatted to Robert Zemeckis long time ago about it, and he almost described it as kind of like the breathe out moment. That after a very intense period of time, you could start to enjoy it a bit more, not least because A, you were out in the open, and B, you were further away from Hollywood. And I just wonder what your experience was of that film. If you can, again, put me to being the human being in the midst of what looked like such a delight to make.
It was a delight to make, actually. I mean, for Bob and myself, it was a dream that we could ever make a Western, right? We got to go to work wearing cowboy hats. I mean, how great was that? Yes, we were away from Hollywood. We were in this beautiful part of California. We built this town. We actually felt the nights that we did the town festival stuff, we actually felt like we were back in time, because the generators were way far away. It was quiet. We had ZZ Top on the set with us. They were just fantastic guys. And they were thrilled to be there. And in between takes, they would jam with the local musicians, and they were just playing music all the time. That's one of my best memories of the entire trilogy. And then, of course, we got to climb around on a steam locomotive. I mean, come on, I'm there's still a 9-year-old boy inside of me. What could be greater than that? So yeah, it was just, and then go to Monument Valley and walk where John Ford and John Wayne made all these classic films. It was great. It was great.
And by that point, was Universal at a point where it was just leaving you be? Was it
pretty much?
Yeah, brilliant.
Yeah. They just kind of said, they would complain about the budget, and we would always have a reason why it was more expensive than they wanted it to be. But then, they say, look, do you guys have any doubt that we know how to make a Back to the Future movie? Well, no. So I said, let us do this. And in terms of everything that we learned in Back to the Future 3, there was only one scene that ended up on the cutting room floor.
Which one was that?
We actually, Buford Tannen actually killed Marshall Strickland. That's in the deleted scenes section.
Yeah.
And it left such a bad taste in people's mouth, because, even though Strickland is a spoil for Marty and all that, No, you don't want to see him die. And we had this scene where he's dying, and he says to his young son, "Discipline, son. Remember that word, discipline." But we can't have Buford Tannen pay the ultimate price for murder, because he's got to live on to have progeny, right? So we just decided, okay, we'll cut that out. And at the end, the deputy comes. It would have, in a perfect world, and we could have reshot it, that would have been Marshall Strickland saying, "Tannen, you're under arrest for robbing the Pine City stage." In the original cut, the deputy says, "Tannen, you're under arrest for the murder of Marshall Strickland." And we changed that in post to, a voiceover for robbing the Pine City stage, which they talked about. And that was the only thing that we ended up having to cut.
You talked about in a previous interview, a couple of interviews you've done, about being critical of the way the films were marketed, the lack of a trailer, for instance, the way that audience awareness wasn't necessarily there for the third film. I just wonder, did it all have a happy ending for you in the end? Come the release of the third film, was that, knowing you didn't have to go back onto a set and just sit in and enjoy it a bit more?
We would say, look, one of my best moments as a member of the audience was going to what was called the back screenings for the opening of Back to the Future 3. In select theaters, we ran Back to the Future 1, then Back to the Future 2, then Back to the Future 3. And the audience that was there for that marathon, they were the diehard fans, and they got every single Easter egg, every little reference that we put into Back to the Future 3. They applauded them. It was just a joy to see that all this stuff that we put into the movie, for those exact reasons, played as well as it did. Now, does it still bother me that they didn't market Back to the Future Part 2 as part 2 of a trilogy or part 2 of the 3-part series? Yeah, I think that would have been a better way to market it, because I do remember people coming out of the theater saying, "Well, that was crummy to have an ending like that." I mean, we did put the trailer at the end of part 2 to let everybody know, and that's something that we copied from Richard Lester's Three Musketeers.
The Musketeers, of course.
Yeah. I remember seeing the Three Musketeers, and which I loved, and then at the end of it, they run this trailer for the Four Musketeers. Oh my God, it's going to be another one. I can't wait. And contrast that with the end of The Empire Strikes Back, where I walked out of the theater saying, "He's in carbon freeze. Han Solo's in carbon freeze. What the hell kind of ending of a movie is that?" So we had kind of both things going on with Back to the Future Part 2. And so I said the trailer was to let the public know, don't worry.
Yeah.
We made Back to the Future 3 is coming, and here's what it looks like. But still, I think they would have been more satisfied if they knew at the point that they bought their ticket that they were going to see part 2 of 3. And of course, this is a non-problem today because everybody knows there's 3 of them. Everybody knows.
Absolutely.
Okay, there's 3 of them.
Absolutely. I mean, you talk there about the hardened fans. What I find interesting with Back to the Future is, I mean, everyone seems to be a hardened fan. And I showed my 8-year-old the third one. We just did the whole trilogy for the first time. And he just sat in wonder at it. And it's just like,
well, he's never seen a Western.
Well, tried. I've tried. I mean, he saw Rango. That sort of counts. But yeah, it's just like a live action Western. It was just something different. And that
was to him what seeing Star Wars was.
Absolutely.
To everybody in 1976.
Absolutely. And to see an 8-year-old love a Western, he's quite cherishable for me. Really.
Yeah, I've heard that story from many parents saying, "Oh, my kid just loves the third one." Because they've never seen people riding horses. They've never seen all these great Western tropes that we did, you know, the saloon scene and the runaway stagecoach and of course the train sequence.
It just strikes me what a breadth of audience it's attracted. Appreciating I've run over my time, I did just want to ask one last thing, and it's just really, I just want to quote one line back at you, because when I finished watching your Interstate 60 yesterday, I wrote down a line. I hope I've got it right. And you put in there, how many folks can go to space? And I kind of want to put that to you, Bob Gale, if that's okay, because it struck me, if we go back to the 9-year-old writing his stories and standing at the front of the class and finding some fuel and confidence as a storyteller from that, I wonder how you reflect now, because not wishing to put too far forward to that, metaphorically, you have been to space, you have been to places we can just dream about. And I just wonder how you feel looking back.
Listen, I feel like I'm the luckiest guy on the planet. I mean, I'm living, to use the cliche, I'm living the dream. It's the dream of every creative person to not only to be able to tell a story and enthrall an audience, but to be responsible for a piece of work that lasts and looks like it's going to last beyond my own lifetime. That here we are, 41 years after I came up with the idea of Back to the Future. And it's a West End musical, and it's still delighting audiences. And it's delighting, there are a few people in those audiences that, believe it or not, never saw the movie. And it's designed, the musical's designed, whether you're a hardened fan, whether you only saw the movie one time back in the 80s, whether you've never seen it, you're gonna love it, because we've had all those types of people tell us that from our Manchester run. And judging from the audience response, we really have managed to capture the spirit of Back to the Future in this musical. And that was the challenge. That was what we really wanted to do, because, as I said, there's never going to be a Back to the Future Part 4, at least as long as Bob and I are alive, to say no to it. But I think that when people say, I want to see Back to the Future Part 4, that's not what they're saying. What they're really saying is, I want to see a movie that makes me feel the way I felt the first time I saw Back to the Future. That's what they're saying. And that, I believe, is what we can give you with the musical. If you ever get an opportunity to see Back to the Future in concert, where they run the movie with a live orchestra. I know it played at Royal Albert Hall here a couple of years ago. It'll probably come back. You get that feeling that way too, because you have a live symphony orchestra. You have an audience, and an audience with comedy especially, it brings to life. You're just having a good time with a whole bunch of other people who are having a good time. And it doesn't work that way at home. So.
Bob Gale, this has been such a delight, and thank you for letting me go on far too long, and I wish you the best with the musical. And that was my conversation with the wonderful Bob Gale. I could have asked him even more questions, but time ultimately defeated us. As I said, apologies for the slight audio issues, just one of the constraints of recording over Zoom, but conversely, wouldn't have been able to do the chat otherwise, and I'm very, very grateful for his time. Tickets are available now for the Back to the Future musical, which is playing in London's West End at the Adelphi Theatre, and at the point this is being recorded, so this is at the end of August 2021, as you heard, it's still going through previews, but it's coming to the point where you can actually go and watch the show, as audiences have started to do so. As for me, if you want more of my waffling, you can find that on Twitter at Simon Brew. You can find the entire Film Stories project on Twitter at Film Stories Pod. We've got a website, filmstories.co.uk, updated every weekday with movie news, reviews, features, all sorts of mayhem there. You can support this podcast at patreon.com/Simon Brew. You get a lot of episodes early. You get the odd bit of extra stuff on there as well. You can buy our magazines at store.filmstories.co.uk and really help support independent publishing. And if you like this podcast, please, and I'm fully independent, and so this is invaluable gold dust to me, really. If you can ideally subscribe to it or leave, again, ideally a hugely positive review, I'd be hugely grateful for that. Most important thing, though, as always, is you all stay safe and well and take care of yourselves. I'll be back soon with your regular episode of Film Stories. You all take care. Bye bye.